Good morning, good afternoon. What time is it, everyone? Greg Blanchard here. I'm going to intro this today. We're giving Melissa the day off, even though I just saw Melissa join. So maybe we do need her smooth voice to get us started. But we're going to just do a simple webinar today. Some of you have joined our kitchen tables in the last couple months. We're going to kind of blend that approach with the approach of our other webinars that have happened in years past, where we're going to bring in an expert. We're going to bring in someone who can really speak to our topic, but really drill into a more specific topic, and that being yield management. This is a topic that's come up a lot. If you've been on any of the SAM calls or even some of the other webinars that have been going on just throughout the industry, this is coming up a lot. How do we adapt to the unique challenges of 2020, 2021 as we look forward to next season? And I think what's happened in a lot of cases is people start to talk about pricing, but then it just is too big of a topic, or they don't have the expertise to really dig into that. So in this webinar, we're going to dig into that. We're going to ask some questions. I've got Kurt Kinshirf on the line, who's my what would we call each other? Partners in crime, Kurt, with our webinars, something like that. And I've also got Scott Guyette, who is with Specific Gravity, and he's our a huge partner of ours, someone that we turn to a lot for expertise in this regard. So we'll be talking to this guy here in just a minute as well. So let's set up the situation really quickly in terms of what we're looking at and why this is becoming such a unique situation. So I'm going to weigh in on this one. Kurt and Scott, feel free to jump in if you see this differently, or if you see other factors that you are really putting a lot of weight on. But the two things that I'm looking at are local markets and local governments. So markets being the unique behaviors of your markets, specifically locally, but also I think destination for some. But I've talked about a lot of different anecdotes recently, but there are pockets of the United States right now who are completely normal. And there are pockets of the United States right now that hear about that and think that's absolutely bonkers, that anyone could be normal right now. And it's just, I live in Utah. Utah is acting surprisingly close to normal. And there are some resorts that are doing pretty well. There are other places that are, again, Vermont, for example, is taking things extremely seriously. They're very much locked down still. So looking at those local markets and understanding how many people are just trying to act normal and how many people are just staying home and trying to ride this thing out is really important. But then also understanding those local government and watching those local government mandates and how those change is super important as well, because that's going to impact for the most part, what your capacity is and other things. Kurt, Scott, any thoughts on that from what you're watching?
No, I think you nailed it. I think the local market thing is going to be huge, just because not just from acting normal perspective, but as it relates to dynamic pricing, the competitive landscape, right? Keeping an eye on if you're in a market with a lot of close competitors, you're going to probably have to be a lot more nimble than maybe somebody who's got a lockdown on, maybe a more remote setting. So I think that's important. And then from a government perspective, that's going to be the key one. That's unfortunately out of everyone's hands, because any potential capacity restrictions would be coming from those sort of avenues. So
totally.
Yeah, I'd like to add too that I think I've seen in some resorts an unexpected uptick in demand. That has to be, in my mind, a symptom of everyone being on lockdown. If you look at the major metropolitan markets who've been trapped in their, the small apartments, or not really able to get out into their normal outdoor recreation habitats, I think we're going to start seeing some people new to the mountain and new to the resorts that want to escape the city, but still be able to, maintain their comfort zone of distances. And I think a ski resort, whether summer or winter, definitely helps provide that.
Absolutely. That's something that just anecdotally I've seen in Utah is there is a demand for outdoor recreation that I've never seen before. And bikes are sold out at Walmart. I mean, just the racks are completely empty and things like that. It's just very surprising, but I mean, it makes good sense when you just think about the situation we're all in.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point too, because a lot of this conversation that we've been having has been specific to potential capacity for lifts, right? But the same philosophy of dynamic yielding can be applied to any other products that already have natural capacity limitations, and starting to rethink that sort of thing for yielding up because of that pent up demand. So, in the past, a lot of dynamic pricing has been yielding down to fill need periods. But how do you potentially, with all this pent up demand, yield up to historical highs based on that pent up demand? So,
yeah, and that's a great point. We'll get into that in just a minute.
yeah.
So, come on, Kurt, quit getting ahead of us here.
Couldn't hold back.
So we've seen this just at Inntopia as well. When resorts come to us and ask for help on different things, we are seeing just amazingly diverse needs, amazingly diverse problems that they are trying to solve. There are very, very specific local mandates that people come and say, I need something that's going to do X, Y, Z. And others are saying, can you help me ramp up my marketing? Because we're trying to capitalize on all this demand and we're wide open. So it's really been fascinating to watch how different this has evolved across the country. So let's actually officially introduce Scott now. Scott, do you want to just give us, I don't know, 30 seconds on where you got your start, what experience you have, kind of your story so people understand kind of your expertise and your background?
Yeah, I started working at Frontline ticket sales almost a decade ago. That evolved slowly into getting the advanced purchase tickets as well. So I was basically controlling all ticket sales at the resort I was with. And then comes in Inntopia, and that became the alternative to our other platform we were using to sell tickets. And being able to unlock the potential of YieldView really started me down the career path I'm on now. Found it immensely interesting to look at demand curves, to look at price elasticity, and apply that to our special little market here of skiers and snowboarders, and help both skiers and snowboarders get on the slope. That dynamic pricing is sometimes cast in a bad light because it seems as if it's opportunistic on pricing. But at the same time, you can look at that in the other light and say that, well, actually we're opening up the doors for these people who do have flexibility, who can maybe not afford the full price ticket, but they can come on a Tuesday. So we're including them as well as maximizing profits on Saturday, Sunday. So I've been doing this for 6 years now. Heavily tied my wagon onto Inntopia and all the wonderful resorts that go with them. And this season coming up is probably going to be one of the most interesting ones with all the new facets we have to talk about now.
Yeah, totally. Let's dig into that. I mean, you mentioned two of them right off the top of our conversation, which seem at odds, and I want to get your take on that. You mentioned capacity limits. This is a thing that we're all thinking about and talking about. But then we've got this other side, which is potentially increased demand for outdoor activities. I mean, when you look at the season coming up, from your perspective, what are you seeing? How do those balance, or how do those reconcile?
Well, I think we're going to see a reduced ability to actually reach your capacity, whether that's government mandated or just social responsibility on the resort. I don't necessarily think that you can put that onerous onto the consumer. If someone wants to go skiing this weekend, they're going to do everything in their power to go skiing. So I do think that demand is going to increase, but there really isn't a realistic way for the ski industry to increase their capacity at the same rate. I don't think anyone's going to be putting in new resort or new lifts at the resort this season to address this particular change in the industry. Right now, I'm getting a lot of resorts asking how to reduce the total visitation on their peak weekends or holidays. You know, that high influx time frame where historically the crowds were there, and it wasn't a concern, but it may be a concern this season. So being able to reduce capacity and reduce demand while at the same time remaining sustainable. You know, the resorts still have to come out of the season able to pay everybody and hire the hundreds and hundreds of employees it takes to run a resort. So that enters into kind of a big question mark for the lift ticket world. All the passes that have already been sold, you know, anyone in the ski industry and tied to pass sales knows that a ton, you know, thousands and thousands of season passes were sold prior to any kind of national shutdown or serious pandemic concerns. And those passes are still going to have to live up to the promises they made. So I think we're going to see a bit of that responsibility for crowd control being passed on to the ticketed products. Every resort should have a good idea of what their pass visitation is going to be per day. But at the same time, if we're trying to, as an industry, make sure that we are not just selling wide open, full, you know, crowded lift lines and that typical, you know, horror story that we see out of some resorts where lift lines being half a mile long. I think the ticketed product is going to have to be the one that carries that responsibility. I think we're going to see, with an increase in demand, a serious reevaluation of what a window ticket is. I don't necessarily think that the consumer is going to show up at the door anymore expecting to be able to buy the product day of. It's a change to the ski industry, but it's not a change to the world. You know, you would never go to the ticket counter for Delta and expect to be able to buy a seat on the flight that you want that day. Most ticketed events, you know, are selling out well in advance. It's a change in the philosophy that maybe the ski industry isn't quite able to be a walk-up sale anymore. Certain days, of course, you know, if you have the inventory and the space to do so, there's no need to turn down that sale. But for the most part, I think we're going to start seeing peak periods being blacked out for windows. And that will trickle down into the advanced purchase world where you can capitalize on the increased demand while still basically putting a price fence up to reduce some of that demand. And I've even seen, even this past season before any pandemic concerns, there were resorts that just had hard capacity issues that would just stop selling online. You know, if you haven't bought your ticket already, if you're not a season pass holder, I'm sorry, but we can't accommodate you today. So it's a big change. I do think we're going to see more demand, and I think we're going to see a tighter control on the supply.
Interesting. That makes a lot of good sense. Let me dig into a point you made, which is, you know, there are going to be things happening. The season is going to evolve as the season is in progress. And, you know, one of the reasons that we like working with you so much is, you know, you take a very unique data-driven approach to each client. It's not just a blanket data set that you just apply general principles to. You really work very individually with each client. But in a lot of situations, you know, based on just how the season unfolds, you don't have to do a lot of changes to the pricing model once it's in place. As you look to this next season, how do you see that unfolding in terms of, you know, your initial data strategy and then also evolving as the season progresses? Is that going to be part, a much bigger thing, is just constantly watching the data and making changes?
Yeah, so when we build a price model for a resort, the historical data is really the foundation of that. If we can look through what has been happening for the past years, we can get a pretty good idea of what's going to happen in the years to come. This year is a little different than that. You still can expect your holiday seasons, your peak weekends to be pretty busy. But one thing we can't necessarily expect is this new freedom of working from home, of these school schedules that are a little bit less predictable and more uncertain, and what kind of free time that opens up for the independent traveler. So when we build a price model, we're going to look at everything that we have that's hard factual data, and take that all into account into building a price model. That the goal is to, maximize revenue, maximize visitation, and hold the line on yield, basically. So make sure that all three of those individual variables are lining up to what the goals are. Historically, in the past dozen seasons or so, you could kind of set off with that information. You could have your price model in place. And you could, throughout the season, of course, you should be looking at it and measuring it to goals. But this season, with so much volatility in what we used to look at as just a general market, I don't think it's going to be quite as cut and paste anymore. I think we're going to need to be able to be flexible. We're going to look at trends as they're happening. You need to be well on top of what your sales paces are. You need to be able to identify the days that are selling unexpectedly. You need to identify the days that are selling well expectedly and make sure that you're maximizing the revenue, and kind of it's not a price fence, but at the same time, if the demand is great enough, then the resort has that in their back pocket as a strength to charge a price that seems appropriate. So without the predictability of years past, I think we're going to start seeing some shifts to midweek and less historically demanded times. I think those trends will reveal themselves as the season progresses. And I think the resorts at the same time are going to have to be thinking about, how do we control crowding on the peak times? That's one of the biggest questions we have right now. But part of the outcome of that, when you start controlling that crowding, is where does that overflow go? That person who simply wasn't going to pay the peak price to come on a weekend, would they still want to ski? Are they going to come on a Monday, Tuesday? Can they work from home? Can they shift their schedule around? Are the kids out of school? So being able to watch what's happening as it unfolds right now is pretty important. And the historical data is still going to be important, but it's also going to be more important, I would say, to be able to be flexible and nimble on the fly as the season unfolds.
Gotcha. Yeah, you mentioned a really interesting thing there, that I'm starting to see more and more in the summer, is that as much as the historical is going to be important to establish that baseline, I feel like that's going to be really helpful for the historically high demand periods and potential periods where you can potentially yield up. What's almost more interesting to me is the rest of the time, because you alluded to it, but we're starting to see a lot of messages from people for the summer, like, come stay for a week and work from here. And I wonder if that will exist in the winter, where due to the broader landscape of potentially yielding up during traditional travel periods, would somebody say, what, I can quote unquote work during January from, destination X. My kids aren't really in school anyway. They're doing 2 hours of online learning a day. So let's just take advantage of, January or whatever it may be. And watching some of those unexpected travel behaviors shift potentially because of potential up yielding and other factors is really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, let me dig on one aspect of that. We've all kind of touched on it, but with a unique market, with a unique season, could potentially come unique products, or maybe not unique, totally unique products, but a different strategy toward products. When you have a limited capacity, you can look at increasing that capacity in a lot of different ways. One would be, you have morning and afternoon. I mean, you mentioned that when we first started talking about this. I mean, what do you see in terms of product strategy changing within that pricing strategy?
One of the big pinch points for a lot of resorts is going to be that uphill capacity, especially anyone who's been on snow during a peak period knows that that first chair up is definitely the most valuable. I've seen some resorts going to a reservation system where you will get maybe a push notification that says, hey, you've got 15 minutes to get to the lift. It allows that skier or snowboarder to not stand in line and wait, crowded with other people. They can be in their room, or they can be getting other tasks done. And I think we're probably going to also see maybe a resurgence of that half-day ticket that everyone used to sell, where the consumer may forfeit first tracks. They might not be interested in getting that untouched snow. They just want to be able to get on the lift easily, so they're going to maybe move to that afternoon only ticket. There's really, the sky's the limit on what that product looks like at the end. I've had conversations with resorts wondering if selling hour-long tickets might be the way to go. If it's number of runs you get and then you're maxed out, basically offering more options to fill in these new needs is going to be a thing this year for sure. And what one works best really is going to depend on what that resort's individual needs are, what their individual market looks like, and how they need to handle it within, as we said, the governmental constraints, the social constraints. It's going to be a big question mark as to what one makes sense for which resorts, and I'm not sure there's going to be one that fits all.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I'm yet to see a strategy or a solution that I feel could work across the board. I mean, let alone half the industry. I just feel like it's such a diverse landscape this next year. And I think that, I mean, it really supports what you just said, supports that need to watch the data and take a more strategic approach, because we're used to yielding by day, but if you start to yield by parts of the day, that's something people aren't used to. We've got to really be on our toes for things like that. Let me, if you guys know me, if you're those that are listening, if you know me, you know that I always like to have some, there's information that's valuable, but I always like to share something that is very specific and applicable. So I've asked Scott just to share a few tips, things that you can do to either think about or start doing today to be ready for the next season. So Scott, I mean, what's on your mind? What are some things that resorts really should be thinking about or doing right now to be ready?
I think the COVID-19 pandemic may be the death of what used to be a window ticket. I think resorts are going to have to take a real hard look at what a window ticket is and how it functions, what the rate is, what the availability of that is. Because the last thing anyone wants right now is to have all the information that you have on, this is our pass holder visitation, here's our advanced sales, here's our expected frequency products, and then have that, be an acceptable plan. They got the right staff in place, they've got the right queuing in place to make sure that everyone can keep their distance and still have a good time. Well, with the window ticket, the way it's always run, if you have a surprise uptick in window ticket sales that day, it throws all that into the garbage bin. So I don't know if many resorts will be able to even offer a window ticket through holiday periods, through peak periods. the next biggest one is being able to be flexible, having all the systems in place to take a hard look at what your advanced sales are doing, what the expected capacity actually is with versus visitation, and then be able to change. You may get into season and need to change what was thought to be a good price model, may need to get completely flipped on its head. Maybe the demand is out of control, at which point the resort has the opportunity to make sure that they're still showing a profit while reducing the crowds. And in these unpredictable times, there may be a change in demand that we can't even predict now, where people are happy to stay home and there's not the need to go skiing. Well, maybe then we look at the flash sale idea. The price-driven consumer will eventually make a move if the price reaches here. So being flexible on that is going to be paramount for 2021. I do think, just logically, everyone should be pushing advanced bookings. That's kind of a no-brainer now. People don't want to have the in-person transaction. They don't want to be handing over a credit card or cash and wait in line to purchase a ticket at a window or a desk. I think advanced purchases are going to be more valuable now than they ever have, and not just more valuable to the resort, but the guest is actually wanting that. They don't want to be surprised at the window by a wait or a price increase. They want to show up to the resort and know that they have a ticket waiting for them and they're good to go for the day. So advanced bookings, I think across the board, not just lift tickets, not just adventure, not just lodging. I think everything is going to have an uptick in people purchasing well before their day of arrival. And then, between what YieldView can do and what a dynamic price model can do, when they're combined together, it's one of the most logical and first steps to actually help control visitation numbers and at the same time protect the revenue that the resort needs to operate.
I think that's a fabulous point, and I think that's been lost in some of the conversations I've heard and listened in on, where people are thinking about yield management purely in terms of making sure that they get the most revenue that they can, or the revenue they need to cover their expenses, or whatever. And yeah, it's when you talk about capacity, it is a tool to make sure that you don't exceed your capacity. It's not just one or the other. It really done well, it does both things for you. That's a great point. There was a question that came up, and I'll pitch this to you, Scott, is, some of these things, and maybe you've alluded to this, but some of these things are things that some people have been arguing for in terms of advanced booking is something that collectively as an industry, we're all pushing for. Are these changes to these 4 points you made, being, taking a hard look at the window, if that's realistic, being really adaptable, advanced booking, and then that dynamic pricing to control visitation, is there anything that's going to be bad that comes out of this long term, or are all these things that we almost a good excuse to really finally nail down and implement as an industry?
My biggest concern as far as this season goes is that resorts are going to have to use price as a fence. They're going to have to use price and availability to control the numbers. The image that comes out of that is never good. It's one that the ski industry has struggled with for a long time, of being overpriced and elitist. So for the resort, the teams on the ground in the marketing world and the frontline world, they're going to need to be well scripted and well thought out of, we're sorry that, you're unhappy with the availability of a ticket today or the price of a ticket today. But here's another option. If you can look to these time frames, we're opening more availability on midweek and the price is much more reasonable. and it may push people to season passes. It may push people into, further advanced bookings. Their window, I think we'll see a growth in that, where historically, if you look at, a typical resort, the booking window is going to be 3 to 5 days for most people. I think resorts are going to start seeing that being, maybe a week to 10 days now, just because you're going to have people almost clamoring. If the demand that we're seeing now in the summer continues through the winter, you're going to have people almost going to a bidding war to get a lift ticket, which elevates the value of the lift ticket, and it really does elevate the value of a season pass or a frequency product. So it does bring into question, what does it truly cost on average to ski a day? What is a lift ride worth? It's going to be a hard question for the resorts to answer, but each resort gets to set their own price. So if your resort has that monstrous demand, it's not outside of capitalism to just say, well, this is the price. We have X number of spaces to ski on our slopes, and we're trying to provide the best valuable and enjoyable solution, because no one wants to wait in a lift line for an hour. So I think we're going to start seeing prices change. But hopefully with that, and with the new normal of working from home and online learning and all the hard schedules we used to have slowly decaying, I think we're going to start seeing resorts being able to say, oh, well, midweek is now it's the moneymaker. Like the weekend, we have to deal with crowds, and obviously you generate revenue off of that. But now maybe I think we're going to see midweek become much more valuable. The off-peak seasons become much more valuable. The downside is that marketing message, that guest service and frontline message of this is why we're doing what we're doing, and this is why the price is what it is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think that's really interesting, and how, like I was mentioning earlier, how potential price can push behaviors that the industry has always wanted, right? We've always tried to figure out how to move people to midweek. We've always tried to figure out, how do we eliminate anonymous window transactions from a data perspective? So it's really interesting. And to your point, from a marketing perspective, I think that message, obviously we have the, perennial sort of curmudgeons that are always going to hit on that. But I think, it's not too difficult to set the stage by looking at other industries. Like you mentioned earlier, if you walk up to the Delta counter at the day of, try and get a ticket, it's going to be astronomical. If you try to travel on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, it's going to be astronomically priced. Why? Because there's only so many seats on a plane. There's only so many seats on your mountain now. Yeah, it might hurt for a little while, but it could be interesting to play out that message and see what positive behaviors that we've always tried to have happen, if we can make them happen all of a sudden. The other interesting thing I'm curious about is we focused a lot on lift and lift ticket pricing as a way to drive behaviors. But in any of the conversations you've been having with people, have you I know I have personally, they're trying to use other products to also lock in some of that capacity, whether it be lodging or private lessons. And are you having discussions about dynamically pricing other products that may have historically not necessarily been yielded?
Yeah, really any product that has a capacity or it has a ticket aspect to it can and should be dynamically priced. For anyone who's been in the industry long enough knows that a Wednesday by no means has the same value as a Saturday.
Right.
So there's a clear and obvious, disparity between the value of one day or another. Even now, we're talking the value of a time frame versus another. I've seen some of my partners this year working with water park tickets. You know, oddly enough, water park demand is
It's
through the
crazy.
roof right now.
Yeah, I know, it's bananas.
They have the ability to raise the price, and that one makes that particular water park more valuable, you know, in terms of revenue. But it does provide a more valuable experience to the guest who shows up not fighting the crowd, not worried about social distancing as much, not having to, you know, go through hour-long waits to get into the resort.
Yeah.
So yeah, the downside is definitely there. You know, if you were the unfortunate traveler who didn't think in advance, who didn't make your purchase, who was not a pass holder, who didn't show the loyalty to the establishment, you know, you might get lost in the fold a bit there, which
Yeah.
does leave, you know, it's guest recovery. Everyone has their own method of doing it.
Yeah.
But
And I
it's
think
going to be
that's,
re-education.
yeah, exactly. I was going to say that is the sort of the marketing challenge of the year, is communicating out all this madness to everyone to try and limit those potential occasions where somebody might just, you know, show up at Wally World and the gates closed, you know. So I think that's an interesting one. One other thing I wanted to ask you about is something we threw out there as just sort of crazy talk when this all started happening, but what are your thoughts on the potential for aftermarket or just straight up upbidding starts happening with some of these things, whether it's almost like a StubHub model or, you know, eBay, whatever it may be, where, you know, maybe it's even the resort running the model where it's just like a bit away. We're not going to cap the high end of these prices, maybe, you know, for holiday or something. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's something I would definitely recommend a resort to look at.
Yeah,
If you have the capacity and you have that market share to even consider this, you know, the mom and pops, the smaller
sure.
guys, they're not going to have the ability. But if you look at the big players, you know, in the past couple of years, if you go to, you know, your favorite, you know, 1 million plus skier visit resort and try and find a window price, it's not really that easy to do.
No, no.
You know, and the window price, I think is probably going to evaporate slowly. It's going to start at the top and come down, but there's no reason, you know, if things devolve in some sense or evolve into that scenario where it is, you know, it's just, you know, we have an expected, you know, 5,000 pass visits today, which leaves only 3,000 ticketed visits available, and here's the starting price. I can see how that would be, you know, a little bit hairy to roll out, but if
Yeah.
that is what's going to happen anyways, the resort should own it. You know what I mean?
They
There's no
almost
reason
take it out of their,
to
yeah,
let
it's like
the
you
third
guys bid
market
it up.
control it.
Yeah, not us. You know,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
yeah. It's a potential revenue generator for sure. Um, it's just I think the big question there is it's certainly possible. It's nearly happening already. If you look at last season of
Yep.
how these, you know, you could be spending over $200 a day for a lift ticket. Currently, you know, that already was an opportunity for last year. If you had no advanced purchase, if you didn't take any steps before you got to the destination, you could easily spend $200 to ski for one
Yeah.
day. And I don't think that's even the ceiling.
No.
I think there's room to go up from there for some of the big players. It's just, can they do it in house? Are they going to do it in house? If they don't do it in house, are they losing that revenue to the person who is doing it third party?
Right.
And it's a moral and ethical question, but overall, you know, it's business is business, and if you
Yeah.
want to ski during this peak time, it might be the new normal.
Yeah. I've always had a challenge with the moral and ethical here, and not to say I'm some big curmudgeon, but just the bad rap that the ski industry gets in comparison to some of the other activity industries out there. I mean, look at golf. What does a round at Pebble Beach cost? You know, and there's some of the best ski resorts in the world would be, you know, a very easy analogy to a Pebble Beach, and I, you know, they get stick over it because there's this perception that it's unlimited inventory, but now all of a sudden you throw that out the window, and it's like, well, why shouldn't we get, you know, recover our expenses in a way that allows us to operate? You know,
Yeah.
I get there will be stick, and that's just the nature of the beast, but yeah, it's interesting conversation for sure.
Yeah. And could you imagine spending Pebble Beach prices to go get a tea time and showing up and realizing that you got to wait for hours to get
Right,
that tea time?
exactly.
So
You know, and it'll be interesting to see if people spin this as a positive. You know, remember how crowded it was before? It's not anymore. You know, but that requires us to do X, Y, and Z on the cost side. You know.
Absolutely.
Totally. You guys are going in a really interesting direction. Maybe this is the follow-up webinar is Scott and Kurt dig deep into, you know, what that could look like, because it's fascinating. I mean, just one little point about this is, you know, you mentioned earlier, Scott, that the water park that you're working with has really raised their rates because of the demand, and no one is worrying about the perception of water parks in the industry being expensive. There's these little things that you don't always think, you know, we sometimes, I don't know, we kind of need to separate what we can control about that and how much of it is just, you know, maybe things we worry about that aren't necessarily as important. So
the other interesting thing in that case too that we haven't discussed is, to some degree, reducing capacity reduces operating costs, not on the pure lift side, but in this water park example, I think that we're all talking about, because they reduced their capacity, they some of the variable costs also went down. So in their yielding, they were able to make the same, if not more, money than the previously crowded scenarios, because they were able to reduce some of their operating costs on the back end as well. So really interesting conversation in that, you know, reduced operating capacity, you know, where do you make up some of those reduced operating costs as well and factor that into this whole model? It's just, this year is just going to be such like a case study that we'll look back years from now and be like, look at all this stuff we learned, and did we have some of these outcomes that we've been trying to do forever that we were forced into doing, and now we've managed to change behaviors in a net positive way for the industry. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me wrap this up. We went over 30 minutes, but under the initial 60 minutes that we had allotted for this webinar. So I'll wrap this up with some thoughts of mine just on the Inntopia approach to this, because I think it's really, from my perspective, it's really important, because you know, we work with Scott because Scott is the one that is on the calls with you. Like, yes, there's value in you know, people at Inntopia being very well versed in yield management and understanding and, you know, being able to execute on it. But having someone like Scott, who has been on the front lines for so long and is actually doing the work, having him be on those calls is huge. So our approach is pretty simple. We start with the yield view. Scott mentioned that. That's our calendar-based booking engine for, you know, anything date specific, tickets, lift tickets, water park tickets, whatever. And we talked about this a little bit, but it's one of the most important things we're seeing in this year is high availability, right? We're seeing a huge spike in demand for specific days based on when tickets are released. And so the high availability has become super important, but the flexibility is important too, because it can adapt with those changing products throughout the season. And then we obviously build on Scott's expertise, because he has that frontline hands-on experience to really take what the client needs, take what the resort needs, and understand it and you know, make sense of it. The next step obviously is data, and we talked about that, how, you know, start with that baseline of data from last year, but then also bring in that data as we go to adapt. And then I think, from my perspective, one of the biggest ones is the way we handle support, which is that very proactive support. And if a lot of you on the call are Inntopia clients, and you understand what that means, that Kurt likes to say, when you call us, we actually pick up the phone, and that's going to be super important this year. You can't just set it and forget it and expect it to work. You've got to have regular check-ins, look at the data, mix that with Scott's experience, and really be able to adapt and adjust quickly to what's happening. So that's our approach. I really appreciate Kurt and especially Scott for joining today and talking through all this. I don't see any more questions in the questions box, so we'll call it here. But thank you everyone for joining. Thanks again, Scott and Kurt, and we'll talk to all of you guys next time, whenever that next webinar is.
Thanks, guys.
Good to be here.